With our morning prayers, as we usually do. Again, recalling the purpose of prayers to really align ourselves, to put our minds in the right direction. And we begin by thinking about the Buddha, all these other holy beings who were just like us, dealing with our sort of crazy, confused minds. And they decided at some point to develop their minds more deeply. And so we can kind of align ourselves with them, think that we're receiving their inspiration and blessings so we can follow in their footsteps and become just like them. To the founder, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. Homage to the Supreme Buddha, homage to the Dharma refuge, homage to the great Sangha, to all three ever devout homage, to all worthy of respect, bowing with bodies as many as all realms atoms in all aspects, with supreme faith I pay homage. So now we recall some of the basic teachings of the Buddha, and then also in the verse that's there from the Vajrakuta Sutra, reflect on the transitory nature of things as well as their empty nature, which again is a subject we'll be looking at in more detail today. Do not commit any non-virtuous actions. Perform only perfect virtuous actions. Subdue your mind thoroughly. This is the teaching of the Buddha. A star, a visual aberration, a flame of a lamp, an illusion, a drop of dew or a bubble, a dream, a flash of lightning, a cloud. See conditioned things as such. Through these merits may sentient beings attain the rank of all-seeing, subdue the foe of faults, and be delivered from samsara's ocean, perturbed by the waves of aging, sickness, and death. And we'll do a short mandala offering. Again, whenever we receive teachings, it's good to create some merit as a way of offering to receive these teachings. But we're going to think here again about all the holy beings, the Buddhas, Bodhisattvas, all our own gurus. And we're making this strong request to them as we offer this vast, pure mandala, wishing to receive their inspiration, their blessings, their guidance, so we can achieve a realization, especially of the topic we're studying, the perfection of wisdom, as well as all the topics of the Lamrim. This ground, anointed with perfume, strewn with flowers, adorned with Mount Meru, 4 continents, the sun and the moon. I imagine this as a Buddha field and offer it. May all living beings enjoy this pure land. Idam Guru Ratna Mandalakam Niryatayami. And then finally, refuge in bodhicitta. As usual, we do this once in English, twice in the Tibetan, bringing to mind these two thoughts of finding safe direction, a heartfelt refuge in the 3 jewels, especially the Dharma, that is the main jewel for us to take refuge in at this point in our spiritual development. And then also in the last 2 lines, cultivating the motivation of bodhicitta, thinking that we're here engaging in these teachings so we can eventually be of greatest benefit to all beings. I go for refuge until I am enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. Sangye chodang soki choknam la jangchu bardu dakni kyabsu chi daki chunyen ki pe sonam gi Dola Panchir Sangye Drupar Shok Sangye Chodang Soki Choknam La Jangchu Bardu Dakni Kyabsu Chi Daki Chunyen Gipe Sanam Gi Dola Panchir Sangye Drupar Shok. Okay, thank you, Mary, for sharing the prayers. Let's go ahead and do a short meditation then, as usual. So we'll do a few minutes of calming the mind, again, using the techniques that we discussed in the perfection of concentration. Setting our focus on the breath is probably the easiest object to work with. If you have another object you prefer, though, you can do that. Then through the force of our concentration, we stay single-pointedly on that. Through the force of our mindfulness, we don't forget that that's what we're doing. We don't, let the mind wander away from that object. And then thirdly, through the force of our introspection, kind of checking in occasionally when we see that we've lost the object, that we have wandered away, that our mindfulness is gone, then we restore that, kind of letting go of whatever it was that distracted us and bringing the mind back to the breath. So we'll do a few minutes in silent meditation, and then I will lead you in a short reflection to strengthen our bodhicitta motivation for today. So now let's turn our attention to generating the best motivation for being here today. And recall from last week's class, we began this investigation into this fundamental ignorance that is at the root of all of our problems. It is at the root of all suffering for ourselves and all beings. And sometimes we find it hard to be told that we're ignorant, that we lack knowledge, or even as we went through last week, to admit to the fact that we are misconceiving things, that we are actually believing in something that is a complete lie, that is not existing in reality. In ordinary everyday life, if someone told us that that was the case with regard to some of our conventional beliefs, we would really be offended. But when the Buddha tells us this, the Buddha is giving us this information because of his compassion, because he doesn't want us or any sentient being to suffer for 1 second longer needlessly. So first examine this reality in regard to yourself, to kind of be able to take in what the Buddha is saying with an understanding that the Buddha doesn't want you to continue to believe in this fictitious way that you yourself exist, that all phenomena exist. Wants you to develop the sword of wisdom that will cut through that ignorance and thereby release you from the bonds of samsara. This is the mind of renunciation that is the cornerstone of moving in the direction of Buddhahood as well. To recognize that we ourselves are tired of continuing to go from life to life under the control of this ignorance, continuing to experience dissatisfaction, suffering. We've had enough, and we want to be free of this ignorance once and for all, and taste the freedom that comes when we've pacified the mind completely, when we've removed all of those afflictions, all the karma that we built upon them, so that we then are free from the round of samsara and can attain the peace of nirvana. And then within that understanding of our own situation, we open our eyes to the reality of others. We acknowledge that every single being who is still within samsara is just like us. It should break our hearts that these beings too continue to suffer so needlessly. And moreover, we should want to join the ranks of the Buddhas to be able to impart this knowledge, this wisdom to them as well, to help them to break the bonds of samsara and to know the peace that comes when they have removed that ignorance and again all the afflictions and karma that is built upon that. So this is the mind of bodhicitta, that while it is built upon the foundation of renunciation, extends that compassionate wish to other beings, not just compassion for ourselves and our own situation, but an acknowledgement that all beings are the object of our compassion. All beings should ideally be free from that ignorance. So when we turn our minds towards developing this wisdom, the perfection of wisdom, we should try to do it within that motivation, that we're not just doing this for our own freedom, our own liberation. We're doing this so that all beings can be completely free of all that obscures their minds. And we recognize that in order to help beings to this degree, we absolutely have to become a Buddha. We have to develop our own abilities to the greatest degree, our own potential fully developed. So again, let that mind of bodhicitta that is intent upon achieving that goal of your own complete enlightenment for the benefit of all sentient beings kind of deepen in your own heart so that everything we do becomes a cause for that final result, the enlightenment of all sentient beings, yourself included. Okay, wonderful. Again, it's good to see you all today. Let's go ahead and kind of get grounded back to where we're at. We're working our way through the 6 perfections. This course seems like it's been going on for years, but it has in some way, because we started it before my 6 months away and what have you, and now we're sort of finishing it off. We started with what are said to be the easier of the 6 perfections to practice: generosity, extending our mind of giving, as well as the habits of giving that follow from that: physical giving, verbal giving, and so on. And then ethics, having a good foundation of morality, stopping harming others, but moreover benefiting them through our actions. Patience, having the mind be undisturbed in the face of whatever we experience in terms of our own suffering, the harm that is caused to us from others, even our own difficulties in practicing the Dharma, especially in realizing emptiness, this topic we're currently looking at. Then fourthly, the joyous effort, the enthusiasm that we need to develop, especially the last 2 perfections of concentration and wisdom. Concentration being that mind that can remain single-pointedly on any object that we choose, so that we can delve very deeply into the various topics of the Lam Rim, and especially the wisdom that we need to generate. That is the topic of the 6th perfection that we're studying currently. So again, there are different ways that wisdom is presented, as well as ignorance, which is, wisdom is the antidote to ignorance. Wisdom itself, though, is described, as we shared last week, it's described as a mental factor that's able to correctly discriminate the object of analysis. When this is conjoined with bodhicitta motivation, it becomes a perfection of wisdom. So wisdom, as it's being described here, is a virtuous wisdom. I mean, we do have afflicted wisdom. We do have incorrect sort of discrimination of things, analyzing things. And this is what our mind of ignorance is doing, is it's not, going to the depths of truly seeing things as they are. But wisdom here, in this context, is a virtuous state of mind. It's together with that correct analysis and correct discernment of the nature of reality. So, the practice of special insight, or what's called in Tibetan laktong, in the Sanskrit it's vipassana. This is the cultivation of a particular type of wisdom. That is the wisdom discerning the true nature of phenomena. So of course in the Lam Rim, this is how the perfection of wisdom is mainly taught. We can say that there are, as we did last week, a variety of types within wisdom: conventional wisdom, ultimate wisdom, the wisdom that knows how to benefit other beings. But the main one that we always talk about in this context is the wisdom, as it says there, discerning the true nature of phenomena, really investigating into how do things exist. This is something that beings won't do generally unless they are encouraged by someone who can move them in that direction, such as the Buddha. Generally speaking, there are 2 types of ignorance. So again, this is what we went through last week, was introducing ourselves to the opposite of this wisdom, the ignorance that we need to remove through the force of our wisdom. And we can, again, divide that into 2, though there are obviously many types of ignorance. Confusion about the meaning of reality itself, which again is the main topic we're talking about here, the ignorance that is bewildered about the nature of the self, and so on. And then the second one, confusion about such things as the law of cause and effect. So again, the karma, the law of cause and effect, is also something that beings are ignorant in regard to. They don't have that perfect knowledge of how things come about. We do have great confidence in cause and effect in our physical world, but nonetheless, when it comes to our experiences, we somehow think it doesn't apply. So most beings don't live their lives by any kind of karmic understanding. But the more important ignorance that we're going to be mostly addressing in this remaining classes we have on the perfection of wisdom is confusion about the meaning of reality. And recall that last week, I shared how this ignorance that's operative here, it's not just a not knowing. Sometimes we talk about that, in regard to ignorance in general. Well, I'm ignorant of this, ignorant of that, means I just don't know about it. And then, you have to do is learn about that. But moreover, this type of ignorance is a misknowing. It is looking at things incorrectly. It is on the basis of what we are experiencing, holding on to some level of reality that isn't there at all. So it's kind of a compounded form of ignorance in a way, because it keeps us in this mindset that, again, never really questions things, because we think that things exist in the way that we are apprehending them, we are conceiving them, and the way that they appear to us. We're going to talk about that a bit more today, how that ignorance arises. So this ignorance is, something that's a bit difficult to overcome, because it's the stuff from which we have been dealing with, our situation in samsara since beginningless time. We went into that a little bit last week. I want to spend a little more time on that because there were some questions about, beginningless time and this ignorance being there and what have you. So I thought I would share a little bit about what His Holiness says on that. But let's go back to there's one. Actually, I'm sharing here a few new slides. These are a few bits from Virtue and Reality, which is a free book that Lama Yeshe Wisdom Archives published of Lama Zopa's teachings, some on emptiness. Rinpoche says there's no beginning to our experience of samsaric suffering, and so far, it has not ended. Why do we still suffer? Because we have not yet realized emptiness, the ultimate nature of phenomena, that things are empty, that things exist merely in name. So we're going to talk about those ideas. Things are empty. What are they empty of? I mean, empty doesn't just mean, non-existent, or that they're empty of any kind of functionality or existence. The idea is that they're empty of a specific way of existing. And then that things exist merely in name. In the end, this is the subtlest way that everything exists. So things do still exist, but nonetheless, they have this quality of emptiness. But as Rinpoche points out here, we've had no beginning to our experience of samsaric suffering because we haven't yet realized that truth. We have not discovered reality, he says. We have not discovered the wisdom that cuts the root of all delusion and karma, the true cause of suffering, the cause of samsara. We have not eradicated ignorance, the unknowing mind. So again, this is kind of introducing this idea of ignorance being at the root of all of our problems. And even though it's framed here in the context of mostly looking at it from the point of view of our own personal situation, just as we did in the meditation today, we do have to start there. We do have to see that this is reality for us. And when we talk about this practice of the perfection of wisdom, obviously it's in the vein of a bodhisattva, someone who is intent upon, going beyond their own personal liberation. But as I pointed out in the meditation today, we have to start there. We have to have that self-compassion that really wants us to be free of this. There's that phrase, been there, done that. Well, we could, put that on every single lifetime we've had. We've been here and we've done it. If there's no beginning to samsara, especially, well, then we've done everything. We've been in every possible state of existence. We've sampled all the various pleasures of samsara. We've done everything, but we've never found any freedom from this process of going from life to life. So the initial step is to have that renunciation, to move away from our own patterns of suffering, to want to be free of our own ignorance, but then to recognize that we do have to go beyond that. But nonetheless, the bodhisattva, and I'll explain this in a little more detail later today, but the bodhisattva absolutely will have to remove first their own ignorance and their own stuff. How else can we become qualified to help others? But moreover, we have to remove even subtler stains in the mind, things that keep us from having the omniscient mind of a Buddha, which of course is the goal in the Mahayana practices, in these six perfections, is to go beyond just results that are only about myself and to try to achieve a state where we can benefit all beings. So let's go back to the slides and continue taking a look. I think I'm going to, if I recall how I put these slides together yesterday, I've got the tree of samsara coming up again. Rinpoche goes on to say, we have continually been creating ignorance, the root of samsara. Instead of meditating on emptiness, practicing mindfulness, we have been making our mind more and more ignorant. That's why we continue to suffer. So again, this was the diagram that I shared last week of the tree of samsara. Again, just something that I put together that I think works for me, and maybe it does for you as well. Very briefly, again, the root at the very bottom there, number one, is ignorance. The ignorance, it's clinging to the I, especially the person, and all other phenomena, everything else that exists, to be what we call truly or inherently existent. Again, this is what we're going to be exploring as we go through this, is what do we mean by that and how do we refute that? The trunk of the tree are all of the thoughts that arise from within that ignorance. We have wholesome thoughts as well as unwholesome thoughts that arise within ignorance. Of course, the more problematic ones are the unwholesome ones, like anger, jealousy, pride, and so on. But nonetheless, the wholesome thoughts are still together with ignorance, so they're only going to produce results within the tree of samsara, never anything that's outside of this cycle. The branches are the karma. the actual actions that we engage in through more dedicated mental action, as well as physical and verbal actions that arise from that. And that karma, then creates the fourth item there, the fruit. And the fruits are different depending upon the karma we create. If we create unwholesome karma through the delusions of anger, attachment, and so on, we then engage in actions that are propelled by that, then we actually create more suffering for ourselves. And by suffering here, we mean the grosser form of suffering, pain, separation from what's pleasant, and so on, all the various things that are in that category. If we create wholesome thoughts and then have wholesome actions that follow from that, that wholesome karma does create fruits that are what we call happiness, that are pleasurable experiences and so on. But once more, they're all on the tree of samsara. We never know any pleasure that's outside of that. So again, in order to achieve liberation for ourselves, we have to uproot this ignorance. But moreover, we have to go again. This is really just looking at the whole cycle of samsara. We have to remove even the subtler stains that aren't exemplified on this chart, which will allow us to actually become a Buddha, and in that state of omniscience, help all beings to attain the same state. So what I'm going to do here is go into a little bit more of a discussion about how this ignorance is beginningless, how mind is beginningless. Although some of us have had these teachings before, there's some wonderful passages on it in this new set of books that have come out, part of a series that's being called, I think, the Library of Wisdom and Compassion. There are like 5 or 6 volumes now, I think, that have been published. And in the third one, which is called Samsara, Nirvana, and Buddha Nature, His Holiness, writing with Venerable Tupten Chodron, say, the ignorance that is the root of samsara is beginningless. The Buddha said, a first beginning of ignorance, monastics, cannot be discerned. I didn't proofread well enough again, sorry. Of which it can be said, before that there was no ignorance, and it came to be after that. Of course, what we talked about last week, and we're going to get into, as well as the passages from His Holiness's book, The Universe in a Single Atom, where he talks about how you can show that mind is beginningless too. But our ignorance is beginningless because the Buddha himself, of course, scripturally is saying this, but we can prove it as well. We can at least have some semblance of a proof through our reasoning that our ignorance must be beginningless. In the Tears Sutta, the Buddha gave a series of vivid examples, illustrating the length of time afflictions and karma have bound us in samsara. This is from that sutra. Again, they're usually called suttas in the Pali tradition. So this must be from the Pali canon. The stream of tears that you have shed as you roamed and wandered through this long course of samsara, weeping and wailing because of being united with the disagreeable and separated from the agreeable. This alone is more than the water in the 4 great oceans. That's how many tears we've cried through our own pain and misery. Pretty profound that the Buddha's, pointing that out to us. For what reasons? Because, monastics, this samsara is without discoverable beginning. A first point is not discerned of beings roaming and migrating, hindered by ignorance and fettered by craving. And the Buddha highlights craving or desire often as one of the most direct causes of our suffering, because although ignorance is at the root, it's through our craving that we actually get caught up in patterns of clinging to samsara and clinging to all these worldly pleasures. And then through that clinging, when we don't get what we desire, we experience the anger, the aversion energy. But craving is one of the most direct ways that we are getting caught up in patterns that keep us bound in samsara, though the root, again, is ignorance. So the Buddhas are saying very clearly, why is it without, a beginning, and why have we been going from life to life without any beginning on this, wheel of samsara? Because we've always been hindered by ignorance and fettered by craving. For such a long time, monastics, usually would say bhikkhus. Bhikkhus is the Sanskrit or Pali word that is used to refer to monastics. For such a long time, bhikkhus, you have experienced suffering, anguish, and disaster, and swelled the cemetery. We've had more corpses that we've left behind in the wake of all of our existences. It is enough to experience revulsion toward all formations, enough to become dispassionate toward them, enough to be liberated from them. This is kind of once more him emphasizing, and that's why I did a brief reflection on renunciation, that this is where we have to start, is kind of say enough is enough. I've been there, done that. I've had enough of samsara. thank you very much. I want to be free from it myself. Once we develop that, then we can build on that and think about others and their desire to also be free from suffering. Then this is from one of the first, I think, volume 1 of that series of those books that His Holiness and Venerable Chodron are doing. It says, the Buddha explained the continuity of life and rebirth principally on the basis of the continuity of mind. The continuity of mind across lifetimes is not the gross level of mind that is dependent on the physical body. Now, why is that so? Well, whoops, I wanted to not go to the next slide. Why is it so that we wouldn't have that gross level of awareness be what migrates from life to life? Because it is contingent upon whatever being one has been born as. So we have, obviously, and we know this from the animal world, right? That dogs' hearing is very different than ours. Their smell is very different than ours. They can smell things at traces that we can't even pick up. That's why they use dogs to find people in the woods or whatever when they've been lost. They have a much more refined consciousness when it comes to certain senses. But then when we look at the dog's mental consciousness and their intellect and their conceptual mind, it's really quite basic. They can learn a lot of things. They can, be taught many things that they can repeat upon some sort of conditioning. But nonetheless, I can't sit a dog down and teach it about emptiness and about samsara and, how they might become a bodhisattva. And you can, good, fine, talk to your animals like that. Good. It's good to plant those seeds in their minds just by saying the words, but don't expect your dog to start meditating on emptiness. It's just not going to happen. So those grosser levels of consciousness are more dictated by the type of being that we are. The subtler level of consciousness, and they often point out 3 levels of consciousness: the gross, the somewhat subtle, or, and then they have the very subtle. The very subtle is the mind of clear light. According to the tantric teachings, they say there is this mind of clear light that is sort of in some ways, a bit of a pure, non-conceptual awareness that's way down deep under the surface. And of course, that only manifests through various times in our lives in very brief ways, and then at death in a more prolonged way, potentially. And then through yogic practices that are done in the tantric tradition, especially highest yoga tantra. But that mind of clear light is sort of the thread that goes from life to life, that has always been there. It goes back without any beginning, forward without any end. So when we talk about the continuity of mind, we're not talking about the grosser levels of mind. But of course, that continuity of that very fine awareness that's at the core of our mental capacity is essentially, while it has that fundamental purity, is still tainted and carrying with it the sort of mental energy that we create. So all of what we create karmically within this lifetime, through the bookends of when this existence began and when this existence ends, does create imprints that travel with the mind, that are there to flesh out the various experiences we have. But when we talk about continuity of mind, we're talking about this subtlemost mind. And as long as we still have ignorance kind of hanging around with that mind, in some way obscuring that mind, but not in the actual nature of that mind, again, because that's why it can be removed. It's not actually, you are not fundamentally ignorant. You do have ignorance that exists since beginningless time, but it can be removed because of the clear light nature of the mind. But the idea here is, again, that until we've done that work, we're going to continue to go from life to life. This stream of consciousness that is the subtlemost mind is just going to continue to be clouded and overcome by all of the various other factors that we've created, including our own ignorance. So Venerable Chodron and His Holiness go on to say, it is the subtlest mind, the fundamental innate mind of clear light, that is the final basis of designation of the person, that is the final part that we could say is the continuity of person from life to life, although we are different people in each existence, again, based on our karma and what rebirth we take and what have you. But that is what connects one life with the next. The detailed explanation of this mind is found only in texts from the highest yoga class of Buddhist tantras. So I hope you don't mind. I'm taking a little bit of an opportunity, because this came up last week, just to give a bit of a review in some ways, but perhaps for some of you, give you more information about what we mean by this process of samsara and what it is that is the thread that connects us from life to life, and that will connect you even into your enlightenment, when the mind of clear light is completely manifest and you no longer have anything that obscures it, that clouds it. Then to go back then to His Holiness's book, when we start talking about mind, I think it's always important to go back to the fundamental definition of mind. And His Holiness in that book says these two features, luminosity or clarity, and knowing or cognizance, have come to characterize the mental or mind in Indo-Tibetan Buddhist thought. So when we often define mind, we say that which is clear or luminous, and knowing, meaning that it has the nature of clarity, luminosity, which His Holiness is going to explain, and then it has the function of knowing. That is what the mind is about. That is its only function, is to know, to cognize. So clarity here refers to the ability of mental states to reveal or reflect. And of course, it implies a non-material quality, that they are essentially, things are appearing to the mind through that luminosity, that clarity. And then they are known by the mind. Knowing, by contrast, he says, refers to mental state's faculty to perceive or apprehend what appears to that clear mind, that what is reflected within that mind. So all phenomena possessed of these qualities count as mental. So even our ignorance, we could say, is a mental phenomenon. Again, you can't point at ignorance as being something physical. These features are difficult to conceptualize, but then we are dealing with phenomena that are subjective and internal, rather than material objects that may be measured in spatiotemporal terms. Right? We're talking about mind. Mind is not something we can look at and put a microscope to and measure and do all the various things that we do with our physical world. And this is, of course, the challenge when we start working with mind in a Buddhist tradition, is to really clearly understand what it is. But the scientists in the West have been struggling with this for centuries, and I don't think they've even come to any united agreement about what consciousness mind is. In fact, again, the traditional ways of looking at it have come to be questioned through a lot of the investigation into the nature of mind or consciousness recently. His Holiness continues, he says, perhaps it is because of these difficulties, the limits of language in dealing with the subjective, that many of the early Buddhist texts explain the nature of consciousness in terms of metaphors, such as light or a flowing river. Again, why we call it clear light mind, or the light quality of our consciousness. Or again, the flowing river is the idea of it having this continuity to it and never really ending, going all the time. So as the primary feature of light is to illuminate, His Holiness says, so consciousness is said to illuminate its objects. Just as in light there is no categorical distinction between the illumination and that which illuminates, right? We say that the illumination of the flame or the bulb and that which illuminates are the same thing. It's that illumination that illuminates. So in consciousness, there's no real difference between the process of knowing or cognition and that which knows or cognizes. In consciousness, as in light, there is a quality of illumination, kind of bringing our awareness to bear with what we are apprehending, what we are knowing in the physical world, as well as, of course, in the mental domain. So again, I'm just going into a little bit of background here, and His Holiness is going to go into the proof that I mentioned last week and even a little bit earlier about how we can actually come to understand the continuity of mind to the degree that it's taught in Buddhism. Crucial to understanding the Buddhist concept of consciousness and its rejection of the reducibility of mind to matter is its theory of causation. The issue of causality has long been a major focus of philosophical and contemplative analysis in Buddhism. Kind of got another error there. Sorry. Okay, so again, this is just His Holiness saying that causality is at the core of so much of what we talk about in Buddhism. We're just talking about karma. Karma is a process of causality. But even in our physical world, again, we see causality all over the place. We know that things arise from causes and conditions if we open our eyes to that reality. Well, consciousness too has an element of causality. So he says then, Buddhism proposes two principal categories of cause. These are the substantial cause and the contributory or complementary cause, or sometimes we call those conditions. Take the example of a clay pot. The substantial cause refers to the stuff that turns into a particular effect, namely the clay that becomes the pot. And of course, clay comes from other things too. I mean, it's not to say that clay doesn't have its own substantial causes, but when we talk about a pot that is made of clay, the clay is the main thing that transforms into the pot. We have a lot of other factors involved, but that's the substantial one. By contrast, all the other factors that contribute toward bringing about the pot, such as the skill of the potter himself or herself, the kiln that fired the clay, remain complementary in that they make it possible for the clay to turn into the pot. Without those other factors, of course, you don't just form the clay and then the clay becomes the pot. You need to have, the potter making it into the actual pot, to have the kiln, and of course, everything that leads the kiln to be there, all of the what produces the heat and so on, even the oxygen that's required. All of these various factors would be participating in the production of the pot. But again, the substantial cause was the clay. The distinction between the substantial and the contributory cause of a given event or object is of the utmost importance for understanding the Buddhist theory of consciousness. This is again why we can say consciousness does have its own continuity apart from the physical. While in this existence, obviously our brain, central nervous system, all of our senses are involved in our creation of moments of consciousness, they are not the substantial cause. According to Buddhism, though consciousness and matter can and do contribute toward the origination of each other, one can never become the substantial cause of the other. You can never get a moment of mind from something that is material. You can never get something material from a moment of mind. They don't have that substantial entity that is in alignment that would allow that to be occurring. In fact, it is on this premise that Buddhist thinkers like Dharmakirti have rationally argued for the tenability of the theory of rebirth, which of course, this is what we're examining, as rebirth as a beginningless rebirth, because the implications of what His Holiness says here is that it has to be beginningless. So this is how Dharmakirti's argument is formulated. Let's go through this. And I think it is important just to get exposure to this, whether you've heard it before or not. But the consciousness of the newborn infant comes about from a preceding instance of cognition, which is an instance of consciousness just like the present moment of consciousness. That's due to the fact that we need a substantial cause for that moment of consciousness. It cannot be from matter, cannot be purely from the brain. It has to be within the sphere of something that is of similar nature to it. Something that is consciousness cannot be produced from something which is matter. Physical matter does not produce consciousness. Only consciousness produces consciousness. The issue revolves around the argument that the various instances of consciousness we experience come into being because of the presence of preceding instances of consciousness. There's always going to be another moment that comes before it, and then before that, another moment, then before that, another moment, before that, another moment, and so on, ad infinitum. And since matter and consciousness have totally different natures, the first moment of consciousness of the new being must be preceded by its substantial cause, which must be a moment of consciousness. Otherwise, again, you'd have consciousness arising from matter or arising causelessly. He doesn't talk about that, but that would be another consequence, right? If it doesn't arise from consciousness and it doesn't arise from matter, well, then it must be arising causelessly. Well, is there anything in the world that arises without its causes? Any conditioned phenomenon? It all depends upon its causes in order for it to come into existence. We're going to see this later when we talk about the reasoning of dependent arising. It's another reason why I wanted to share this, is because it gives some very concrete examples around consciousness itself in terms of understanding its dependent nature. It depends upon its own substantial causes, and then, of course, other complementary causes or conditions that contribute to it. In this way, the existence of a previous life is affirmed, right? Because if you require a previous moment of consciousness for any particular moment to arise, then that too requires it, and you go back and you always have another existence prior to that, another existence prior to that, another existence, and so on. Reams have been written, he says, on the analysis of this form of Buddhist reasoning, the technical aspects of which lie outside the scope of the present discussion. The point I wish to make is that Dharmakirti clearly did not think that the theory of rebirth was purely a matter of faith. Do you believe in it or don't you? No, I mean, it can be something that can be proved by this analysis. Again, we have to start with the given that consciousness is something that is not physical, and that it has this nature that we are describing, luminosity, clarity, and then that its function is to know. If we define consciousness that way, and of course, as I said, scientific people may not define consciousness that way. They may have another way of talking about consciousness. But in Buddhist terms, this is what we mean. And it really holds true in my own, investigation into the nature of mind. There is simply this clear phenomenon that is impossible for us to point to, or to give any kind of physical attributes to. It's just our awareness that has this stream that is always requiring something prior to it to give rise to the next moment. So if we look at it from that point of view as a reasoned analysis of why there are previous existences, why there will be future existences, then again, it gives us a different way of approaching it. Venerable Robina, when she teaches on rebirth, she often says, this isn't a matter of, simple belief. We can make this a working hypothesis as well. And the same goes for karma, any of these topics. But with this one in particular, I think we can use this sort of proof as it's put out by Dharmakirti as a way of gaining a deeper conviction. To understand that if this is the nature of mind, then it absolutely requires prior moments of mind. Therefore, mind can't come, as the way scientists would say, materialists. Of course, materialists maybe are less prominent in the scientific community these days, but nonetheless, they would say that consciousness is this co-emergent property that occurs when all of the electrochemical stuff can happen within the brain of an infant, a fetus. In the womb, there is some point where the brain becomes a stable enough foundation for all of that to manifest. They would say that it's that emergent property that occurs then, that continues on, and that then disappears when death occurs. They don't get into the whole issue of what happens after or whatever. They just simply say that consciousness itself is only this property that occurs. Whereas Buddhism says, no, I mean, you're talking about then that consciousness arising from something that is physical, that electrochemical stuff that's going on in the gray matter of an infant or a fetus. It's not. Consciousness, once more, is a distinct phenomenon. But this is really central to Buddhism, obviously. So again, I'm just pointing this out within the context of understanding what we talked about earlier, that our ignorance is beginningless because our awareness is beginningless. Our consciousness is beginningless. So His Holiness goes on, he says, Dharmakirti felt that it falls within the purview of what he characterized as slightly hidden phenomena. Remember this from last week, right? Which can be verified by means of inference. So recall that there were three different types of phenomena that I went into last week. Manifest phenomena are those things that we can know through direct perception. So, the colors and shapes and sounds and all the various things that we can know through our senses are all manifest phenomena, right? They appear to us and can be known by those consciousnesses without a whole lot of thought process involved. We do get thought involved in designating things and what have you, but nonetheless, there's very direct, perception of those things, a sort of direct cognizance of them. Slightly hidden phenomena, these are known through reasoning or inference. And this is where rebirth falls, and this is also where emptiness falls. We can know emptiness through reasoning, through inference, just like we did with this process of looking at rebirth by understanding the nature of mind, by understanding the whole process by which kind of require a substantial cause, as well as cooperative conditions, but the primary thing being the substantial cause that has to be another moment of mind, and so on. We can know that there is the existence of prior lives on the basis of that inference, on the basis of that analysis. Emptiness is the same. And this is what we're going to begin our process of today, is looking at the analyses, the things that help us to discern the nature of reality through taking a hard look at it, actually investigating, actually, putting on our thinking cap and see, how is it that things do exist? How do they not exist? And then, of course, last week I also mentioned the third category of extremely hidden phenomena, and that should be known. Another error. Anyway, I need to do better proofreading, I guess. Known through reliance on reliable scriptural sources. So the Buddha can, say this is how certain things come to exist through karma. We can't know that directly, and we might be able to infer it to some degree through our study of karma. But that's still taking the scriptures that the Buddha taught on karma as the source of that. I can't, if I lose some money, I can't go, oh, I lost that money because 5 lifetimes ago I stole from somebody and now it's manifesting in me losing money. I mean, I don't know that. I don't have that direct awareness. A Buddha would have that awareness, but a Buddha can teach that and impart some wisdom to understand the basic ways in which we create our experiences. But in terms of the specific knowledge of that, it's extremely hidden. It's really not something we're going to have in the scope of our knowledge until we become enlightened. But emptiness is only slightly hidden. Hooray. We don't have to do too much work. We just have to do the reasoning and the inference, just like we did with regard to the mind, understanding again its beginningless quality. So if we look at, the even earlier in the slides that I showed you, there was those sutra quotes about ignorance and samsara being beginningless. Well, some people may have great faith in the Buddha, and they can just read that and go, then I believe it. The Buddha's a perfect guide. I don't really have any problems with the Buddha. So if the Buddha says that our ignorance is beginningless and our stay in samsara is beginningless, our minds are beginningless, well, then that's good enough for me. But some of us may require that deeper investigation in terms of wanting to know that for ourselves. So hopefully in my sharing that with you, you gain some appreciation for the logic of why we can say that our ignorance and our minds are beginningless, our stay in samsara is beginningless. But it isn't endless. I mean, the mind is endless, absolutely. Our ignorance being in the mind is something we can put an end to. Ignorance has been in our minds since beginningless time, but it doesn't have to be in our minds. This is this word that they use all the time. It's adventitious, meaning it's there because we haven't created something to offset it. We haven't created something to get rid of it. As soon as we get rid of it, it's gone. So this is, again, the promise that we have going forward. Looking back, there's no beginning to all of it. And we can say again that our ignorance has been there, but ignorance, by virtue of having been there since beginningless time, isn't removable from them, or isn't not removable from the mind. It is removable from the mind. It's something we absolutely can overcome. And that's, of course, the confidence that we need in engaging in these teachings and these reasonings in order to accomplish that. So let's go back to the slides just for a little bit more, and then we'll have our break. Hard to believe we're already almost an hour into it. This is the one thing I was going to share last week. It was kind of the next slide, and I inserted all these additional slides prior to this simply because I did want to explore with all of you this whole concept of the continuity of mind, the beginningless nature of mind, and so on. This is how Lama Zopa Rinpoche, in his book Virtue and Reality that I quoted from earlier, a few pages after that one, he talks about how we grasp at inherent existence. And I would use his words directly, but I'm kind of summarizing them in a bit more of an enumeration here. Essentially, what happens when we talk about this idea of inherent existence, which we're going to explore more today, first of all, the basis for some object will appear to us. It can be, the basis for what we call a cell phone or an iPhone. It could be the basis of a computer, the basis for a book, the basis for a person. Something will appear to us that is the basis for that, and that ends up getting labeled as a particular object. So what is appearing before you now? I mean, I have a computer, a laptop before me. So I've got a laptop that is the label being given to this basis for a laptop computer. The basis includes a screen and, the keys and all the little, bits and pieces inside of it that function, the processor, all of these various things, which are also labeled on their basis. But we had, at some point in our life, we were introduced to the basis of laptop computer, and then we gave it that label. Again, and this all happens really quite quickly, right? But we labeled it as laptop computer. In the very next instant, the object then appears to exist from its own side. It's kind of giving us a false appearance as soon as we've given it a label, because the label we give to it of laptop computer, I often say it kind of like it absorbs into the basis, so that the basis and the label become pretty much indistinguishable. It appears to have its laptop computerness from the side of the basis. It's no longer dependent upon me simply labeling it, giving it that name. This ignorance is going to have this to work with. That's why number 3, the ignorance is assenting to that false appearance. If things weren't appearing falsely, perhaps the ignorance wouldn't cling to things that way. But we have 2 things involved in the process. After we simply label it in the first step, the object appears to exist from its own side. It has this false appearance. Lama Zopa often talks about this. He really highlights this. Because if you think about it, this is what we're trying to refute, is the sense that things have their own identity, that they are established from their own side, that from the point of view of that computer or screen or whatever it is that's in front of you, phone, that there is something that is its nature existing on that basis. That's how things appear. And then, as it says in the third step, our ignorance agrees to that false appearance. We don't even question it. We think that that's exactly how it exists, and we assent to it completely. We think that things exist on their own, self-established, that their identity comes from the basis as opposed to from our labeling, which is how it got the label or the identity of a laptop computer in the first place. If we look at, I'm going to come back to this in a moment. I want to break the screen for just a moment. If we look at, new things in our world, because it's very hard for us to remember when we were first introduced to the various things in our world as infants, children, oh, that's a book, and oh, that's a cat, and that's doggy, and that's, whatever. It's hard for us to recall all of those instances. But look at what was introduced in terms of the iPad, right? That wasn't that long ago that they introduced the iPad. And I even remember how when the Apple store down in Albuquerque, they were going to have the huge opening where people were going to come and be able to purchase their iPads. And they were interviewing people on the line. And this one person they asked, they said, you're here to get an iPad? And he says, oh, yeah, I can't wait to get one. And the person says, well, do you know what it is and what it does? And the person said, no, but I really want one. So even just getting the label in their head without even seeing necessarily the basis was enough to have some sort of clinging going on already, some desire, some, I want that for me kind of energy. But of course it's based on, there was something there that they saw ads for, or they had some idea through Apple's promotion, publicity, that they were going there to get this new object. But this is, as soon as they gave it the name of iPad, on the basis of this, screen with, again, all the little inner workings and blah, 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 then they had the phenomenon existing. As soon as somebody gives it the label of an iPad, of course, now we have a lot of different, generic forms of it and what have you that we would call a tablet or whatever. But the idea is that as soon as the label of iPad was given to that basis, that's when iPad came into existence. Prior to that, of course, who was working on it prior to that, maybe they were giving it some sort of a working name as it was going through all of its iterations and processes until it was ready to be marketed. And then they give it the name of iPad. They go, oh, let's call this the iPad. Well, until that labeling is going on, iPad doesn't exist. The basis the moment before that was simply a basis that was suitable to be called iPad because that's the label they gave to it. But that's essentially when iPad came into existence. As soon as the label of iPad was given to that, it's as if iPad and the label, as I said, they kind of merge into one. All of a sudden, it seems like the iPadness is covering that whole object, right? That basis that didn't even have that identity prior to that. So Rinpoche says, the first step is we give it the label, but then the label seems to merge into it, and it appears back to us in that way. It appears as if it's got its iPadness established on its own. It had nothing to do with us calling it an iPad, had nothing to do with us labeling it in that way. It has its own identity at that point. Now, again, iPads are a problem because of the clinging that we have to the I that is wanting the iPad and craving the iPad, like the guy in the line who, wanted it no matter what, didn't even really care what it did. He just knew he wanted it. So things get more complicated when we start talking about the I, whereas the phenomena in our world, we have this problem going on, but it's not until the I gets involved that it becomes a real serious issue for us. But this is the first, again, the first step, we label it. The second step, it appears to be that, to have its own identity as that. Then thirdly, our ignorance goes into full gear and thinks that that's exactly how it exists. It exists on its own. It exists as an iPad from its own side. It exists as a laptop computer from its own side. It exists as whatever it is that we've established it at through our own labeling and designating as, from its own side, having its own identity. So the problem, of course, is that this is not how things exist at all. Things exist in terms of the first step, that all of what we have in our world are simply the basis for what we identify them as. We give them their identity. Our conceptual mind identifies them, not just through language, though language is involved in most of what we know. It's the concepts we have about things that organize our world into various colors, the colors of the rainbow and the shapes and sizes and this and that and sounds, and everything gets organized. There's raw data that's coming in. There's the basis for that. But we organize everything through the force of our conceptual mind. We give it its identity. There is not one atom of identity from the side of the basis. Everything is merely designated, merely imputed. So I'm kind of jumping ahead here a little bit into the whole process of dependent arising that I'm going to talk about next. But essentially, Rinpoche is pointing out how, again, you have these three things going on. And of course, because we're not newly introduced to phenomena, I pointed out the iPad because it is something new, right? The iPads didn't exist when I was growing up. So now you have many new phenomena that are being created in our world, right? That all of a sudden people relate to that, but they do it in the same way that they related to everything else that they designated. And of course, we learn the labels on many things, right? We learn what a book is. We go, oh, when we're quite young, maybe we're not reading Mahamudra, we're reading instead, see Dick and Jane, whatever, it's the Spot, Dr. Seuss, I don't know, whatever we were reading. And we get the idea of what a book is as this phenomenon that usually has a front cover, a back cover. It has a spine, it has pages. And then of course, as a child, it has many pictures that you can kind of look at, and maybe even like little fuzzy felt kind of surfaces. So lots of little things that make it into a book. And we've been imputing book throughout our whole life, but we think books exist from their own side. We think they have their own book nature, that they're self-established. And we've been doing that again ever since we learned the term book. And this is what we do with everything. It appears back to us as if it's existing from its own side, and we agree to that. We keep accentuating our ignorance, furthering our ignorance, deepening our ignorance by grasping at it again and again and again and again. This is what Rinpoche was saying in that earlier quote, right? That's why we're in trouble, is because we aren't in line with how things actually came into existence or how they actually exist. They exist only through imputation, only through our designation. Anything more than that is fiction. Okay, so it's 11:05. Let's take a break till 11:15, and then there I noticed there's a question in the box, so I will deal with that question when we come back, and then I'll also go back to that slide because there was a little bit more I wanted to say about that. All right, so see you in 10 minutes. Take an act of faith to believe it exists back beyond the time when we can remember our first moments of awareness. And he says, around 3 or 4 years old. That's about the general ballpark, I think, for a lot of people, is when they first had that moment that they could recollect. Again, I think it's the same process that we're talking about here in terms of this proof that we would apply to past lives, that we would apply to parts of our life that we can't recall. And again, because we don't, I mean, as Venerable Rabin often says, we don't even have a good recollection of what we thought about during the course of today, much less, when we were 3 or 4 years old. I think the idea is that if there is any moment of consciousness, whether it is one that we are aware of or not, whether it's one we have recollection of or not, because we certainly don't recollect our past lives, most of us. So regardless of what the status is in terms of our ability to know that now through our memory or what have you, that moment of consciousness has to have arisen from a previous moment of mind, and that moment from a previous moment, and so on. So it applies to any moment, whether we talk about a moment of consciousness in 5 lifetimes ago and whatever existence I was in that state, or whether we talk about when I was 2 years old, when I still didn't have any ability to recollect what was happening as a 2-year-old now. Well, still, as a 2-year-old, I mean, my parents, would certainly validate that I had a mind and that I was screaming or doing things, or, you know, all the various stuff I did as a 2-year-old. So my terrible twos. So the idea is that, again, we can apply it regardless of whether we have any recollection or not. There is a little meditation. Maybe I'll share that out on the with Mary through the Dropbox, that you can do on continuity of consciousness, that comes from the first module of Mind and Its Potential, which actually is starting TNL, starting another round of Discovering Buddhism. Shanka will be teaching on that course. If you're curious about investigating mind a little bit more, it's a wonderful opportunity to do that. But that meditation on the continuity of consciousness does kind of have you go back to moments you can recollect, and you go back to that moment that you recollected. It's the earliest moment, and ask the question, well, what was before that? And again, the meditation doesn't try to give you the answers. It just tries to put you into that space of analyzing, thinking about it. Well, what would have come before that? And what would have come before the moment of conception? What would have come before, whatever, so again, I think it's the same logic we apply. Just depends upon, whether we have that understanding as to whether we can say then that must have arisen from another moment of mind. It doesn't have anything to do with whether we can recollect that. And then Dora says, I'm having a fight with my science mind during the break. I haven't thought it through yet. It's saying, but there are unknown phenomena existing that we don't know yet. When we do know, they will get a label, but they still existed before the label. So how do I reconcile that with not one atom exists from its own side? We can say that there are bases for things. There's no problem in saying that bases for things exist. We don't have to necessarily be the person imputing it, giving it a name, a label. The basis can exist without being labeled as what we would eventually label it as. Before you had, an ability to discern the various things that exist in our solar system, for example. People would see Saturn or these various things that got these labels from a distance, but until you had the ability with a telescope to see the rings of Saturn, does that mean that the basis for the rings of Saturn weren't there before they appeared to you and were designated as that? It means that we can say that the existence of Saturn, of the rings of Saturn, depend upon an imputing consciousness to be imputed as such. But the basis for them was there. So I don't think it denies that you can have the basis for things existing, but not existing in a way that we would, again, be involved in all of that. We have to get involved as an imputing consciousness in order to establish the existence of something. But the basis would be there, without a doubt. Maybe do I have that book handy? I was going to read from that. The one class, I don't know, I'm not seeing it right now. It's a book that Genlam Rinpa published. Maybe it's here. This is what he says. This is a book called, it was originally published as Realizing Emptiness by Genlam Rinpa, and then it got another title. I think it's called How to Realize Emptiness. They just give these books different titles, but they're the exact same book. So on page 45, this is where he talks about it. So he says, so this statement that we are making, I'm going to paraphrase what he's saying here to some degree. This statement that we make, it's part of what we call the middle way point of view, that we say that all phenomena exist merely as conceptual designations, may be rephrased in the following way. For me, all phenomena exist merely as conceptual designations. All seen and unseen phenomena belong to this category. However, if one counters that statement with the question, Are all possible phenomena designated by me? Are you designating everything that exists? No, I don't think I have that ability. Then the answer is no. In order to bring forth a conceptual designation, one needs to bring together the basis of designation, which in the case of like the rings of Saturn would be all of that matter that is in a ring that's around Saturn, the various rings. I don't know how many rings are there. Um, but anyway, we'll just talk about one of them. So you need the basis of designation, and then you need the designated object, which is the rings of Saturn or the ring of Saturn. However, one can still say, with respect to me, all phenomena exist merely as conceptual designations because this merely means that they are fit to be designated. They are suitable to be designated. That's the only way that they can come into existence. So again, we can't think about the matter that's there around Saturn until we have a way of designating it as a ring of Saturn. That's when it becomes the ring of Saturn. That's when we give it that existence. Whatever the material was that was there that became the basis of designation for that was fit to be designated, suitable to be designated. I know this starts to sound a little weird, like it's almost a word game or something, but it's how we have to posit everything. That there's a way that we would, like if we look at what people are doing in regard to investigation into the subatomic matter, which again, I'm not an expert on, but I know they've got quarks and subquarks and all this various stuff that they're delineating through going deeper and deeper into the nature of things in a very micro level. Well, we have to say the basis for a quark was there before the quark was observed, but does quark exist before then? No, because quark is what we are labeling it at on the basis of us coming into contact with that phenomenon that we feel is suitable to be labeled as quark. So we have kind of, again, things sort of all there fit to be designated, but until we get involved in them, until we have some sort of awareness of them, they don't become objects of existence for ourselves. So I don't know. That's the best way I can explain it. Otherwise, I think we get into this idea, and even His Holiness talks about that a little bit in this book, How to See Yourself as You Are. Does this mean that our mind kind of creates that matter? No, the matter is there. The basis is there. It's simply whether or not we are designating it as such. Once we designate it as a ring of Saturn or as whatever, or as a quark, then we can say that phenomenon comes into existence because it didn't exist as a quark or as a ring of Saturn from its own side, that basis. That's what happens. As Rinpoche said in that slide, a basis appears to us, we label it as such, we give it that existence, but then it's as if it's got its existence from its own side. It seems to have its quarkness or ring of Saturnness from its own side. That's the error that is appearing to us, and then we agree to that. We cling to that as if it's real. So the basis does exist the moment before. It's not designated as anything because it's simply a basis that we eventually give a designation to. And I don't know if that helps, Doris. So, um,
It
anyway,
does.
okay.
I sometimes have to put my science brain aside. I call it brain actually,
Uh-huh.
to be distinct from mind. But yeah, I just got myself into a knot there during the break.
And I
You
think,
brought me back from the edge.
oh, okay. Well, I'm glad I could do that. But I mean, I think this is how, again, we have to say that there is, there's all this phenomena. Because even if we look back on, okay, well, what about the Earth before there were conscious beings on this planet, right? There was the formation of the Earth. Well, that's something we're looking at, and we're kind of sort of imputing an idea of is when Earth was all the, Gaia and all of these, continents linked together, and then these things spreading apart, and all the various stuff that we impute. This all happened. There's all these things that happened that they, of course, are theories, many of them, but nonetheless, the formation of this planet happened. But until there's a consciousness kind of designating it as such, kind of giving it that label, oh, this is that phase, and this is what happened then, and this is when these gases formed, and when this life, developed, and da 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 da. That's when we bring it into existence. Prior to that, it's just raw stuff that no consciousness is kind of imputing. Now, we can say that a Buddha knows all these phenomena because a Buddha has an omniscient mind, but nonetheless, a Buddha doesn't impute. A Buddha doesn't have a conceptual mind. It's beings that impute. It's how we organize our world, into the various things that we designate things as. So I don't know, this maybe I'm opening up more cans of worms by talking about this, but let's go back to the slide because I did want to kind of highlight this little footnote that's on here. This is a footnote I've put in. This is, Rinpoche would, I imagine, teach this in his teachings as well, but it wasn't in that section. But why do things appear to exist from their own side? Where does that come from? This false appearance, as it says in the footnote, is caused by the latencies on the mind. These bakchaks, I think they call them, that are due to past ignorance. Past ignorance that we've had creates a latency on our minds, a sort of subtle imprint that ripens into things appearing to exist from their own side. We give it that label, and then it seems to have iPadness, bookness, whatever, computerness from its own side. In general, these latencies and the appearance of inherent existence that arises from them constitute the obstructions to omniscience. This is what is keeping you from becoming a Buddha, from having an omniscient mind. While what happens in the third step, the conception of inherent existence, the ignorance and its seeds, constitute what we call the obstructions to liberation. Now, why I'm pointing that out is because, again, I will be going into this in more detail in the Wednesday night class that starts in March on grounds and paths and how the Bodhisattva goes about removing these different obstructions that are mentioned here. But essentially, when we look at what is keeping us bound in samsara, what is keeping us from being liberated, is that ignorance that's mentioned here in step 3, the ignorance that is assenting to the false appearance. That ignorance, and of course the seeds of that, which means that every time we have that ignorance, we create a seed for it to arise again, a karmic potential for it to arise again. And then of course all of our other delusions that arise on the basis of that, all of our karma that arises on the basis, all of that is what's keeping you in samsara. That's the roots of that tree on that thing that I mentioned, had on the slides earlier, right? That's what we mean by the obstructions to liberation. That's what keeps you from knowing the peace of nirvana. To go beyond that to Buddhahood, though, you do have to do the deeper work to remove these latencies, these subtle imprints on the mind that cause this dualistic appearance, that cause things to appear to exist from their own side. In fact, they say that these beings who actually get rid of their ignorance, who go for their own liberation, they achieve the state of foe destroyer or arhat. They still have that false appearance. That false appearance is still there for them, but they know that it's not real. They have no ignorance that assents to it. The third step doesn't happen, but the first two still happen. They still have objects that are labeled, and those objects appear to exist from their own side. It's not until you become a Buddha that you are free from that completely, when you've removed all of those subtler obscurations, and therefore things don't appear to exist from their own side. And of course, you've gotten rid of the ignorance before that. You've even removed that. So I just wanted to point that out because people might wonder, well, why are things appearing to exist from their own side? Is it just something that is the nature of things? No, it's because we have these subtle imprints on our own minds. It's not a fault from the side of the object. When I was talking about, the book kind of seeming to have its own bookness, or the computer its own computerness, or whatever, having its own nature, that's a false appearance to our consciousness on the basis of these imprints we have in our consciousness. But then, of course, we layer on top of that our ignorance that thinks that that's correct, our ignorance that completely believes that. So once you develop some awareness of emptiness, then you can stop the ignorance first. That has to be gotten rid of first, right? Because that is what is keeping us in this whole mess that we are in and clinging to things in this false way. Then we do the subtler work to remove these imprints that actually cause that false appearance to happen. But we have to stop believing in that false appearance. So what I pointed out very briefly earlier is why Rinpoche, I think, does this is really explain in Virtue and Reality, as well as many of his teachings, this threefold process. The basis appears, we label it. It seems like the label is existing from the side of the, the object. Its identity is from the side of the object. And then we agree to that, is because this appearance of things to exist from their own side is exactly what we have to refute. The fact that things do appear to have their own nature. This does seem to have bookness from its own side. When I hold it up, you go, Don's holding up a book, right? We so quickly grasp at it as real because it's appearing to be real. If we could get rid of the false appearance, like I said, I don't think the ignorance would arise at all. But we've been caught in this cycle. We've created through the force of our grasping at things as real, the imprints that cause them to appear as real. And we've been doing this since beginningless time. It's a chicken and the egg thing, right? What came first, the appearance of false existence or the grasping at it? It doesn't matter because they've existed since beginningless time. We've been caught up in this pattern. And through the force of our ignorance, we create more imprints for things to continue to appear to inherently exist. And this is what we've been caught up in since beginningless time. Now we can break free from the whole cycle by stopping the ignorance, because it's the ignorance that is again at the root. But if you want to become a Buddha, you have to go further. You have to actually remove what's causing that dualistic appearance. Why? Because that is blocking the mind from knowing everything. That is acting as an obscuration, an obstruction to the omniscient mind, to the mind of a Buddha. And it's removed through essentially the same techniques that we remove the ignorance, through realizing emptiness. The wisdom realizing emptiness is the main means by which those obscurations are all removed, whether we talk about the obscurations to liberation or the obscurations to omniscience. But of course, for the Bodhisattva, they also have to have the requisite merit. Remember the two wings of the bird. You have to have not just the wisdom side, but the compassionate method, and create all of the meritorious energy that helps you to do that deeper work. So again, this is just something that I thought I would point out as part of this process of looking at how we get in trouble. Again, we are merely labeling things. That's all that's happening in that first step. Some basis is appearing and we're giving it a name through our conceptualization, through our identification, organizing the world around us. And then it appears to have that identity through this fault that we've created through our own past ignorance, making this imprint that causes that false appearance. And then we agree to that. Okay, so I hope I've explained it enough and well enough to give you, some idea of what's happening in this whole, process. So let's go back and do a little bit more on dependent arising, and then I'll see if there are some questions and we'll wrap things up. So, oh, I forgot I had a little bit more on this before we get into dependent arising. Yesterday I was throwing some things in here. Maybe I got a little carried away with the slides, and I apologize. I'm not trying to make it a crutch. I just think sometimes it helps me to recall some things that I think are important to convey in these teachings. So His Holiness in this book, the Dalai Lama at Harvard, which I really like his explanation in there, he says, a consciousness conceiving inherent existence is erroneous. Its conceived object does not even exist even conventionally. The idea of conceiving it as an inherently existent computer, an inherently existent iPad, an inherently existent I, none of these conceptions exist in that way. This is a false conception. It's erroneous. A wisdom consciousness realizing emptiness within observing the very same object which such ignorance observes in its misconception of inherent existence, such as the iPad, the computer, the I, has a mode of apprehension exactly opposite to ignorance. It apprehends the object to be devoid of inherent existence, to lack that. This is what we mean by emptiness again. Empty doesn't mean empty of functionality or empty of existence. It means empty of inherent existence, empty of existing from its own side, and so on. So I just showed you how that ignorance arises. Now we're going to talk, about kind of what counteracts that ignorance, and how is it capable of doing that? It's realizing the exact opposite mode of things that ignorance is realizing. Ignorance is knowing. Let's not call it a realization. Ignorance knows things through the lens of thinking they inherently exist. Wisdom knows things through the lens of knowing they don't inherently exist, refuting that. And because ignorance is erroneous and wisdom is correct, we can do some serious damage to the ignorance. So the absence of inherent existence has a valid foundation. The wisdom realizing emptiness, that object that is being realized, emptiness, absence of inherent existence, has a valid foundation. It's true. Thus, when it is investigated, it becomes clearer and clearer. However, inherent existence, except for our stupidly persisting to believe in it due to former conditioning, is without a reasoned foundation. Thus, the more you look into it, the more it disappears. Try to, provide in this, passage a bit of a segue into how we have to do reasoning. And if we begin our reasoning, we can see through understanding how things actually exist, how they lack the way of existing that ignorance is grasping at. Therefore, we have the direct antidote to our ignorance through this wisdom that realizes emptiness. And also because a consciousness realizing selflessness as well as a compassionate consciousness, remember that method side, are qualities that depend on the mind. And because the mind exists continually, their basis is stable or continuous. We can develop this to where it becomes the very nature of our minds. The wisdom realizing emptiness becomes one with our minds over time. And all that compassionate method side of it will also become one with the mind. This is what we mean by the mind of a Buddha, who then has that perfect knowledge of all things, knowing the emptiness of all things, as well as how to compassionately act within the world to benefit others. So due to this, once one has trained in them, one does not need to rely on repeated exertion to regenerate them. It's not like we have to keep going through this process. We fall from grace with ignorance, and then we have to restore our wisdom, and then we fall from that grace of wisdom again, and we have to restore our, wisdom and overcome our ignorance. Once you do the work is done. So we don't have to rely on repeated exertion to regenerate this understanding, this wisdom. And thus they can become stronger and stronger till eventually that antidote totally overcomes our ignorance and these other obscurations. Consequently, they can be developed to a limitless degree. All of our positive qualities as well as our wisdom, there's no limit to them. Okay, so as a precursor to going into this reasoning of dependent arising, know that there are two types of selflessness that are taught. Now, again, I think I mentioned this last week. When we use the word self, we are talking about, in that term, selflessness, a way of negating this false sense of self, this false sense of identity that exists with regard to both persons and non-persons. And that's the categorization of this selflessness, is that we can first talk about refuting that fake sense of self in regard to ourselves, and we could also do it with regard to other beings who are persons. But then there's also the selflessness of phenomena like books and iPads and computers and what have you, and bodies and minds. Those are all phenomena. They are not persons. So any phenomena other than persons, we often talk about their selflessness in a separate way. Well, why do we do that? Well, His Holiness says we should realize the selflessness of persons with regard to the I first. Since the misconception of the I, as inherently existent, is the root of samsara. I pointed out earlier, if we cling to everything around us as inherently existent, it doesn't become a problem in some ways until we start thinking mine in relation to that. That's my computer. That's my iPad. How dare you do anything to it? Yeah. So this is what His Holiness says, is that that's the initial problem we're making, is with regard to the sense of an I that we have. That's what everything is revolving around. Best to realize the selflessness of the person first, the emptiness of the person first. Moreover, it is said to be easier to realize the first, since it's relatively easy to see that without the mind-body complex, an I cannot exist. How do we identify who people are? I mean, if you look at your screen and see all the little boxes with, the people who have their pictures or they're on live, you identify them on the basis of something appearing there, right? And that appearance is the mind-body complex. We go, oh, there's Mary. I can see Mary in her box, and oh, I can see Victor in his box. So we make we identify a person on the basis of a collection of stuff appearing to us, right? That's already showing to some degree the dependency of that. I think we get it a lot easier with the person rather than a book. I mean, I don't often, have that, understanding that easily, that I see book because this basis for a book appears to my hand and or to my mind. In fact, I often think of this as being an inherently existent book. But I think with the person, we can see to some degree that there's already some level of dependency involved. In fact, some of the lower schools, they only refute things on the basis of that bit of understanding, but they don't go to the degree that we're talking about here in these classes. But we already can sense some idea that the person is dependent upon this collection of stuff. Without this collection of stuff, there's no way that Don is here before you. Without Don's body and Don's mind being there's no Don. So again, this is just delineating these two ways that we want to realize emptiness. Initially, the emptiness with regard to the I, the person that we are, because this is the main problem that we have in samsara. And moreover, we can begin to see, even with ourselves, that the sense of an I is dependent upon the mind-body being here. I don't think I'm in the other room, in my living room. I don't think I'm in my living room. I think I'm here. Why? Because the mind and the body are here. This is where the I just kind of latches on and hangs out with, this collection of stuff. So I already can sense some level of dependency of the I on this mind-body complex. Then we go on to realize selflessness of phenomena. And I'm not saying it's an absolute. You can realize both of those to some degree. And if you're realizing the selflessness or emptiness of the I, in effect, you're realizing the same type of emptiness, just with regard to different phenomena. Then you do apply it to books and to computers and all the various things that exist. And you can find that they too lack inherent existence. But let's start with the I. What I'm going to talk about in today and in next week are two different reasonings, and we're going to use the I for both of them. The one that is today's sort of what I want to spend the rest of today on is looking at dependent arising, the reasoning of dependent arising. And then secondly is the reasoning that we call the 4-point analysis that's often used with regard to the I to kind of begin to understand what the emptiness of the I, because we go looking for that false I that appears to us, that sense of an I that we think is real, that we think has its own established identity. So that one I'm going to hold on to, and we'll put that into next week's class. Today, I wanted to spend just a little bit of time, and then we will do some questions. I notice that the chat box is filling up with a few things, so I do want to get to your questions, but let's go into a little bit more about, I'm going to come back to that slide. I'll introduce that slide next week. The 3 levels of dependent arising. So you yourself, the I, the sense of a person that you have in relation to all of this collection of stuff, has, first of all, a dependence on causes and conditions. Well, what are the causes and conditions that led you to being here? This person that you call fill in the blank, that they've given this label to, that you think of yourself as. Well, of course, it's the causes and conditions that led your body to be here, that led your mind to be here. Many different causes and conditions. So we have an I here because there were all these causes and conditions that led to the basis for the I being here, for your body being here, your mind being here. The body itself, of course, had its causes and conditions, which were the 2 cells from your parents that formed into this body, that have the continuity of matter that became this body that is here with you right now. You have the mind, which again was rising, as we saw earlier today, from its respective causes and conditions, the substantial cause being previous moments of mind that go back to the previous life, to the life before that, to the, without any beginning. You have all of these things that have led to you being here. And of course, you have the karma that created the opportunity for you to now have this human rebirth that, again, we always talk about as being so precious and so on. You yourself are a dependent arising because you arise from causes and conditions. When those causes and conditions change, which it will inevitably for every one of us, and the body can no longer be supported and the consciousness can no longer be supported with regard to the body, and the consciousness departs and goes on to its next existence, you will cease to exist as the you that you think of in this life right now. Of course, we'll quickly impute another I to who we are in the next lifetime, because that's a part of the process. We think of an I in relation to these various phenomena that are the basis for an I, the body and mind and so on. The second level of you existing in a form of dependent arising, arising in dependence upon various factors, is looking at how you depend upon parts. Well, right there in the first one, we talked about 2 different main parts, right? The mind and the body, which again, in Buddhism, we say they're quite distinct. They have an interrelationship, but nonetheless, mind has its own substantial causes. The body has its own substantial causes. So we do have parts that we depend upon in terms of the I, right? The I has this sense of a whole that we give, some identity to in relation to the parts of that I. And we can talk about all the various parts because our bodies have many parts. Our minds have many parts in terms of the different consciousnesses, in terms of the different factors in our minds. So do you exist independent of those parts? No, there is a sense of a whole, an I, that we think of in relationship to these parts. The I cannot exist without the parts, and the parts, of course, can't exist utterly independent from the whole that they're, designated as. And that drives us into the third level, is the understanding that I is simply an imputation, a designation, a label being given by conceptuality to this collection of parts, which are the basis for a person. So the basis for you is your mind-body complex, right? And you think of it as I. Just as when we talked about, the any basis that appears to us, we then give it a label. We then kind of relate to it as being an iPad or as a computer or as a book. That basis, which has various parts, is simply there existing without that identity until we give it that identity, until we impute that label on it. This is the subtlemost way that things exist in terms of their dependent arising. So I depend upon my causes and conditions, I depend upon parts, and in the end, I depend upon merely labeling I to this collection of stuff, this mind-body complex. So anything more than that, as I pointed out earlier, is fiction, is lie, is dishonesty, is ignorance, is mistaken, is erroneous. If we come to realize, this is the whole purpose of this realization, or the working with the reasoning of dependent arising, if we come to realize the very subtle way in which things actually do exist, it negates anything more than that, which is what the mind of ignorance is grasping at, thinking that things have their own identity, that things establish what they are from their own side, that things have that independent existence. Dependent arising says, no, they don't exist this way at all. They arise in dependence upon many factors. They don't have any independent status. They cannot exist on their own as, again, what we believe their identity is. Again, we've given them that identity. As was pointed out, we have the basis appear to us. We label it as book, and then the book, again, will appear to be existing from its own side, but that's false. The very first step is showing exactly how things come into existence. This book, certainly, that I'm referring to in my hand, which is really just the basis of designation for a book. It's no real book, but this has its own parts, has its own causes and conditions, right? We all know this. I don't have to explain them all to everybody. In the end, it also, though, exists simply because I'm labeling it as book. There's no bookness from what's in my hand. And as I was just pointing out, I don't even have a real book in my hand. The label book and what I have in my hand are two different phenomena. One is the label I give to this collection of stuff. The other is the basis for that labeling, that designation. Therefore, there's no real book, even though it appears to have its real bookness. Even though I agree to that through the force of my ignorance, I can undermine my ignorance by seeing how it actually arises in dependence upon these factors, how it doesn't in the end have anything from the side of what I'm holding in my hand that makes it book. Book is a label we give to this. Now, let's get back to the I, because I didn't want to go too far away from the I is also a label we give to this collection of stuff. Each of us has our collection of stuff, the body, that we got from our parents, the mind that came from our prior lifetimes, that is together with all of this, and all the various parts and features of all of that. We think of that as an I. And as I said, we quite naturally think of it as an I. There is this sort of ingrained tendency to impute an I on the basis of some collection of stuff that consciousness is with, because we have, again, that carrying forward from life to life. This is what we call the mere I, this sense of labeling, designating an I in relation to a collection of stuff. But there's no real I here in this collection of stuff. The next analysis we're going to do, the one we're going to do next week, is go look for that real I. And see what the consequences would be if that real I existed in this collection of stuff. Because there'd be pretty serious consequences. The dependent arising is actually the good place to start, because it points out exactly how things do exist. so that then we don't fall into, I had very briefly on the screen these two extremes. We don't fall into some sort of extreme of thinking the I doesn't exist at all. No, you do exist. You're here. You're, watching the screen. You're listening to the words. You're thinking about what I'm presenting. All of that proves that you're here. But how do you exist? You exist as a dependent arising. You exist in dependence upon just the thought I. There's nothing more here that is a real I than that. That's the level of reality that exists, is the mere imputation of an I, the mere I. So again, we'll be exploring this more. Maybe what I will also do is I will put on, give to Mary to put on the Dropbox a little meditation on dependent arising that Venerable Rabina put together. That's on the body, but the body's a pretty close part of how we identify ourselves. So work with the body, come to understand, excuse me, come to understand the dependent nature of the body. And she mostly focuses on dependence through causes and conditions, but nonetheless, that also can point to the fact that there's nothing real from the side of that object, because its very nature is one that has arisen on the basis of all these other factors. It doesn't have any sort of inherent identity. All of this is kind of pointing to the same truth, the same wisdom of emptiness that we're trying to discern in this part of this course, to really get a clear idea of what this means to say things are empty of inherent existence. It means that they cannot have any independent existence. Therefore, I can only talk about them in terms of their dependent existence, that they depend upon other things for their existence. Okay, so I don't know, I'm going to feel like I'm rushing to put a lot of information in the last little part of this because I wanted to see what else was on the chat box here, which I haven't had a chance to look at. So back to David Lee's question, are you saying that the thought process of going from step 1 through 3 doesn't exist for someone with Buddha nature? So it's just a state of non-conceptual emptiness. For someone who's actualized their Buddha nature, who is a Buddha, we all have Buddha nature. Maybe it's just terminology, but essentially what Buddha nature means is that we have our minds are fundamentally lacking any inherent existence, therefore they can develop into the state of Buddhahood. And so there is that kind of pure core to our being that we can actualize in the state of Buddhahood. So if we reword it and says what's going on for 1 through 3 doesn't exist for someone who's a Buddha, they would have, yes, a non-conceptual awareness that is just simply abiding in that space, but through the force of their compassion, compassionately connecting with others and manifesting in forms that are in agreement with the karma of those beings. So a Buddha doesn't sit there and think about, what am I going to do today? Should I help David? Should I help Mary? Should I help anyone? A Buddha just naturally, spontaneously is a source of that through having been conditioned through compassion, and then actualize that wisdom to be able to help beings exactly in accord with what they need and exactly in accord with their karma. So yes, those 3 steps are what's happening with us in regard to our ignorance. A basis is appearing and we give it a label. Buddhists don't even label. Again, I mentioned earlier, they don't have a conceptual mind. They don't need to label. How do they know what things are? Well, things aren't anything from their own side. That's the whole point of emptiness. But they know what beings are designating them as because beings are involved in this process. They give the label in the first step. They give a label to a particular basis that agrees with kind of how we want to relate to that. If somebody decided midway through the process that they wanted to change the name of the iPad to something else, the iTablet, well, then it would have had a different identity as that. you know but we do have conventional agreement that we all agree to call certain things certain labels, to think of them in certain ways in regard to their functionality, their definition, what have you. So for a Buddha, no, they wouldn't be doing that. Would a Buddha have the false appearance? Absolutely not. Would a Buddha have any ignorance? Absolutely not. So this is a process that's delineating how sentient beings like ourselves have our ignorance manifesting. It's on the basis of initially giving a label. That label seems to absorb into the object and come back at us as if it's real from its own side, and then we agree to that. Okay, so then we have the next question. What is the difference between consciousness and the conceptual mind? Good question, Christopher. Yeah, the consciousness is referring to any of the 5 sense consciousnesses or the mental consciousness. And of course, in a broader way, we could say anything that is within those minds. Um, those types of consciousnesses, the only one that has any conceptual component to it is our mental consciousness. Your sense consciousnesses aren't conceptual. Like when you're hearing through just your ear consciousness, hearing the vibration of molecules, it's causing you to hear my voice. That ear consciousness component is just getting raw data. It's not conceiving of things. It is your mental consciousness, and specifically the conceptual mind within your mental consciousness, that is formulating thoughts on the basis of the words that I'm using, that I'm hoping convey the meaning that I'm trying to, convey to you. So the conceptual mind is a part of the mental consciousness. It's probably the most important part in our unenlightened existence, because it's what allows us to reconstruct things, to know things more correctly, to use our conceptual mind as a basis for developing correct awareness. Um, we do have moments of direct perception in our mental consciousness, but then, of course, the main one we're aiming for is to have a direct perception of emptiness where it's no longer conceptual. But we need conceptual mind as sort of a framework to move out of samsara. Just we've gotten into samsara through our conceptual mind, misconceiving things, thinking they inherently exist. We can do the reverse through a conceptual mind to a large degree. Eventually, our conceptual mind becomes a problem. And as I said, Buddhas completely abandon it. They no longer have a conceptual mind, but we need it as an artifice to get us to that direct realization of emptiness. Okay. Oh, nice to see David's comment that I actually had already answered that question he had. I'm sorry. I'm going to the top of the list. So I answered it again. Maybe it was a question for other people too. So it says, this is from TH. I've been working through similar questions. Maybe it's that existence of object A is falsely to us a combination of A's real nature and all of our false filters overlaid over A that we generate once we label A. So realizing emptiness, seeing reality as it is, as a Buddha does, is seeing object A as it is. There's more to the question, but these are just, again, TH's comments, I think, on how she's working with this. Again, whenever we have anything that is appearing that's a basis for something, it doesn't have its own identity, is the point we're getting at here. So for a Buddha, again, the Buddha knows that things completely lack any identity from their own side. You know, the whole phenomenal world that exists around us, as well as ourselves, is all just an interplay of all these various causes and conditions and things occurring. We give it structure through our conceptual mind. We think of this as I, and others as others, and computers and lights and books and all the various things that we organize our world into. We've gotten really good at organizing, the world into a variety of things, and we have that thirst for knowledge as human beings to always keep investigating deeper and deeper. As I always said, all those people who are going to the micro level, or people who go to the macro level to want to know what's at the end of the universe, and what's all happening out. We have this mind that is thirsting to kind of identify and organize the world around us. But the mistake is thinking that the world is organized from its own side. The organization comes from our own minds. We determine what things are. We give them the labels. We give them their identity. They don't have that identity from their own side. Now, there are distinctions, obviously. I can't, start talking about this as a wristwatch, because this isn't a proper basis for a wristwatch. What I have on my wrist is a basis for a wristwatch. And I wouldn't start calling this a book then, because this isn't what we call a book. It has different characteristics, also merely imputed, different features, different causes and conditions, also merely imputed, everything merely imputed, but nonetheless distinctions. That's why we often talk about the world of conventional phenomena as being the varieties. It is the way that all this diverse phenomena appear as the variety of things that we can designate within our world, that we can give some identity to. But their mode, the final mode of analysis for everything that exists, is emptiness. Nothing exists from its own side. It doesn't establish itself as what we impute it as. That mere label we give to it is how it comes into existence. Nothing prior to that gives it that existence. It can be a basis waiting for us to identify and give it, some label, like the, matter that's in the ring of Saturn, that suddenly when we develop the instrument that looks far enough to see what's going on Saturn, we go, oh, there's a ring around Saturn. Okay, now we've given it that label. We've called that matter that was simply a basis for designation, suitable to be designated. We've given it its designation through our own observation. That's the only way that it exists, as a ring of Saturn. So I don't know if that gets at what TH is saying, but the idea is that, again, a Buddha is seeing that lack of inherent existence with regard to everything, and yet also seeing how sentient beings are labeling it in the midst of their ignorance. They're giving it all this identity, and they're, of course, thinking that they exist in this way that they appear, but they don't exist that way at all. So let me see, I'll read the rest. We need to go backwards and peel away step 3, agreeing to our false belief. Absolutely. That's the first step, is to get rid of that ignorance. That's what we're doing in this class, is to try to begin to question, how are we perceiving things? And then that step 2, believing the object appears to be real from its own side, we didn't apply a filter to it. So again, step 2 is the idea that it does have that false appearance. This is kind of, again, that subtle imprint in our mind that causes things to appear in a particular way. We, again, will agree to that quite readily. That's why we have to start with step 3. Stop agreeing to it. Stop believing in it. Undermine that ignorance. And then eventually we can undermine the false appearance. And then step 1, yeah, I mean, again, step 1, it's not that we have to stop labeling things in our conventional world. As long as we have a conceptual mind, we're going to need to label things. We're going to need to label selflessness of phenomena, selflessness of persons. We're going to need to label all the various things that exist. But again, we don't want to get that misconception that there's some inherent existence there. It's only through the force of our labeling that things exist. Okay. And then a comment to Doris, maybe from TH, maybe Venerable Urbina would describe what we're learning as science, and that what we think of as science is a belief resulting from ignorance that keeps us from understanding the science of the mind and the true nature of reality. Absolutely. I think Buddhism is a science. It's a mind science. It's coming to understand things from the vantage point of a Buddhist perspective on the mind. Obviously, that's what I said was the preface for what we talked about earlier today, is that we have to begin with the definition of mind in Buddhist terms. But that's what people are doing in the scientific community when they talk about mind, right? They're giving it a definition. They're calling it a co-emergent property on the basis of da 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 da. So again, I think there's no difference really in terms of Western science and Buddhist science in terms of how they operate. There's just different conclusions. Okay, I'm going to skip over the rest of that. Don, I interpret what you said. This is from TH. Just said, as things do exist, but the existence is subtle, not solid at all. Absolutely. Lama Zopa Rinpoche says, it's almost as if things don't exist. And it's almost as if they don't exist. That's, that almost kind of keeps us from falling over the edge completely and saying things don't exist. But their nature is very, very subtle because it's merely designated. It's merely imputed. Now, again, there are correct imputations. I can't, again, say I'm a Buddha because I don't have the basis for a Buddha yet. I have Buddha nature, I have the nature that can develop into that state of Buddhahood, but I'm not what is a proper basis for putting the label Buddha on it. So we can say that, again, it doesn't mean that we can be haphazard and careless, reckless in our labeling of things. Things do still need to be labeled in accord with conventional agreement. And that's why, again, we still get quite confused and we think, well, then that conventional agreement means that there has to be something from the side of the object that makes it a suitable basis for my labeling of it. No, there is simply, again, the continued labeling that's involved in all of it. I distinguish particular characteristics of me as not being the mind of a Buddha, not having developed my mind to that degree. And on the basis of that, I label myself not a Buddha. But both of those are merely labeled. Both of those are on the basis of observing things and giving them a label. Not having the qualifications to be labeled as a Buddha, therefore not a Buddha. I don't know if that makes sense, but that's kind of how you have to approach it. We add layers on conception on top that make phenomena like a book so solid. We don't separate those layers. We add from the subtle real nature of the phenomena we observe. That's a good part of this process, to see that this is an overlay. This is an exaggeration. This is what ignorance is doing. As I pointed out earlier, that was the point of that thing of saying ignorance isn't just not knowing, it's a misknowing. It's putting on top of what exists a fictitious way of existing. On the basis of that, we get into trouble because we think that things have this type of existence. And that's just made up by our minds. That's made up by ignorance. And, I know that some people end up with that question, but why do we have ignorance? That's, Buddha never answered those sorts of questions. Ignorance has been there since beginningless time. Our minds have been there since beginningless time. What's more important is not to question why it's there, but to get rid of it, be done with it once and for all. So, okay. Oh my gosh, there's 5 new messages. I think we're going to have to end at some point. If somebody could, maybe, I think I can do it too, but if somebody can copy down some of these comments or questions or save the chat box and forward it to me as a file, maybe I can look at some of this before the next class. Some of it seems to be discussions within the chat box, but would you do that, Mary? Are you able to do that?
Absolutely, but you're getting a lot of questions directly.
Are there some? Okay. Yeah, we will recite the sutra remembering the 3 jewels as well. So since we have that to do as well as our dedication prayers, let's close up for today. And I will start with some of these comments or questions. I'll review it before next week. So what I would like you to do again is work with the meditation on dependent arising using the body that Venerable Rabina put together. I'll get that to Mary later today. She'll get it out on the Dropbox soon. And then also, if you want to do the investigation into continuity of consciousness, that will be there. But recall also, again, that will be covered as one of the topics in Shanka's new Discovering Buddhism Module 1, Mind and Its Potential. So, all right, so let's recite the sutra first. Then we can do our dedication prayers. So I hope you can all stay for this. This is to create some additional merit during these 15 days, recalling the various qualities of the 3 jewels. And as you saw last week, we spend most of the time talking about the Buddha, but all of these are important, obviously, in our own spiritual development. The sutra remembering the 3 jewels. In Sanskrit, Arya Ratna Trayaya Anusmriti Sutra. In Tibetan, Pakpa Gonchok Sumje Sudran Pa De. Homage to the omniscient one, purified and consummate, victorious, virtuous, and transcendent, thus gone, foe destroying, entirely perfect Buddha, full of wisdom. The blissfully proceeding, the knower of the world, charioteer and subduer of beings, the unsurpassable and teacher of gods and men, such is Buddha, victorious, virtuous, and transcendent. He who is thus gone exemplifies the merit which is his cause. In him no root of virtue is ever worn away. Through his manifold patience he is exceedingly beautiful. He is the treasure ground of merit, adorned with the tokens of enlightenment. He is graced with the flowers of the marks of Buddhahood. All he does is seasonable and opportune, and nothing inharmonious mars the sight of him. True joy indeed he gives to those who open up their hearts to him in faith. Through the brilliance of his wisdom he is unconfounded, and against his power there is no victory. He is the teacher of all living beings, the father of all bodhisattvas, the king of all superior ones. He is the guide of those who journey to the city of beyond affliction. His wisdom is unbounded, his assurance is beyond imagining, his speech is altogether pure, well-tuned and sweet to hear. Gazing on him one is never sated, his body is beyond compare. By the realm of desire he is unstained, and by the realm of form is wholly uncontaminated. He is not mingled with the formless. He is altogether free from misery, and from the aggregates he is utterly and altogether free. The elements have no hold on him. He has mastery of the sense powers. All bonds he has completely severed, and from all pain he is perfectly and totally released. No craving does he have. He has passed beyond the stream. Perfect is his wisdom, and in the wisdom of the Buddhas past, present, and to come, he has made his dwelling. In nirvana, where all suffering is transcended, he does not abide. His abode is in the very summit of perfection, residing in that place where he perceives all living beings. Such are the sublime qualities that are the greatness of the Buddha, victorious, virtuous, and transcendent. The sacred doctrine is righteous in the outset, righteous in the middle, righteous in the end. Its meaning excellent, and in its words and syllables likewise. It is integral and unalloyed. It is all-sufficing, altogether pure and purifying. Well spoken is this Dharma by the victorious, virtuous, and transcendent. It is a perfect way of seeing and is devoid of ailment. It is perennial and leads us onward. To see this Dharma is to fulfill one's purpose. The wise will see in it their self-cognizing wisdom. The Dharma spoken by the victorious, virtuous, and transcendent is shown to be well-tempered to the instruction and the needs of all. It drives us from samsara and causes us to go to perfect Buddhahood. It is free from contradiction, and in it all is summarized. It is totally to be relied upon. It is a cutting of the root. The Sangha of the Mahayana comprises those who have well entered, wisely entered, entered with straightforwardness and aptitude. Right it is to join our hands before them, and right to make prostration. They are the glorious field of merit. They are the perfect recipients of gifts. They are the object of offering. Everywhere and always they are the worthy object of all offering. Thus ends the Sublime Sutra of remembering the three jewels. And then we go on to our dedication prayers, dedicating all the positive energy we created through these powerful words from Master Shantideva. And before we recite this, bring to mind those beings that you're holding in your heart. We can think also all those beings who are on the dedication list at TNL, all those we know who are experiencing obstacles, problems, illness, who are dying or who have died, who've asked us to pray for them or for whom we've offered to pray. We dedicate for their welfare as we recite these words together. May all beings everywhere, plagued by sufferings of body and mind, obtain an ocean of happiness and joy by virtue of my merits. May no living creature suffer, commit evil, or ever fall ill. May no one be afraid or belittled with a mind weighed down by depression. May the blind see forms and the deaf hear sounds. May those whose bodies are worn with toil be restored on finding repose. May the naked find clothing, the hungry find food. May the thirsty find water and delicious drinks. May the poor find wealth, those weak with sorrow find joy. May the forlorn find hope, constant happiness, and prosperity. May there be timely rains and bountiful harvests. May all medicines be effective and wholesome prayers bear fruit. May all who are sick and ill quickly be freed from their ailments. Whatever diseases there are in the world, may they never occur again. May the frightened cease to be afraid, and those bound be freed. May the powerless find power, and may people think of benefiting each other. For as long as space remains, for as long as sentient beings remain, until then may I too remain to dispel the miseries of the world. Then we do the prayers for these three teachers in our tradition. As we do this, extend this wish for these teachers to have good health and long lives to all spiritual guides. The wish-granting, wish-fulfilling jewel, source of every single benefit and happiness in this world, to the incomparably kind Tenzin Gyatso I beseech, may all your holy wishes be spontaneously fulfilled. Then for Rinpoche, you who uphold the subduer's moral way, who serve as the bountiful bearer of all, sustaining, preserving, and spreading Manjunath's victorious doctrine, who masterfully accomplish magnificent prayers honoring the three jewels, Savior of myself and others, your disciples, please, please live long. And then lastly, for Tenzin Osalhita, Lama Yeshe's reincarnation. Venerable One, to you whose kindness exceeds that of all the conquerors, for those wanderers in far-off places, especially the West, mindful of your loving concern for us and intentionally descending again into a family of a far distant land, we make this request. O Lama, please, please live long. Okay, wonderful. Thank you, Mary. Thank you all for being here today. And thank you for staying on past the noon deadline. I have a tendency to go a little over, but today was maybe a little extreme. So, all right. So again, we will have 2 more classes, I believe, in this series. So I will try to wrap things up in terms of our reasoning in that next Sunday, and then to go a little bit into the finalizing things with the Bodhisattva vows and what have you for wisdom. So, all right. So hang in there, everyone. Stay safe and healthy, and I'll see you all again soon.